The first sign was not the elephant itself. It was the ground. A faint trembling under Roman sandals, too slow for cavalry, too heavy for infantry, moving through the dust like a warning from the earth. Men who had trusted the weight of their shields felt the bronze rims vibrate against their knuckles. Horses pulled at their reins. Somewhere ahead, beyond a curtain of heat and powdered soil, something enormous breathed. And then the shape appeared, a tower of flesh, tusk, leather, and iron, walking toward a battlefield that had been built for men. For a Roman soldier, war was supposed to have rules. Not gentle rules. Not merciful ones. But rules the body could understand. A spear had a length. A sword had a reach. A charging horse could be heard, measured, braced against. Even terror had a familiar shape when it wore a helmet and carried a shield. But the war elephant broke that grammar. It stood above the line like a moving wall. It carried men on its back. It crushed space beneath its feet. It turned the soldier's oldest confidence, the belief that courage and discipline could hold the line, into a question no one wanted to ask aloud. Long before Rome became the master of the Mediterranean, its armies were still learning how wide the world could be. They had fought neighbors in the hills of Italy, faced rival cities, endured ambushes, storms, hunger, and stubborn enemies who knew every fold of the land. The Roman legion was becoming something hard and dangerous, but it was not yet the machine later generations would fear. Its strength came from order, ranks that could bend without breaking, commanders who expected obedience, citizens who carried the burden of war as part of their identity. Rome trusted training. Rome trusted iron. Rome trusted the line. Then came an enemy who brought another world onto the field. The Greeks of southern Italy, threatened by Roman expansion, looked across the sea for help. They called for Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, a man raised in the shadow of Alexander's conquests and hungry for the kind of glory that made names survive death. Pyrrhus did not arrive as a desperate adventurer. He came with professional soldiers, cavalry, phalanxes, officers hardened by Hellenistic war, and something Italy had almost never seen in battle. Elephants. Not many by the standards of Eastern kings, but enough. Enough to turn rumor into fear. Enough to make veterans stare. These animals were not simply beasts released into chaos. They were a system. They required handlers who knew their moods, supply lines that could feed them, routes wide enough to move them, water, patience, training, and nerves that did not fail when the animal smelled blood. Each elephant carried more than mass. It carried psychology. It carried the memory of armies in the East that had learned to use shock as a weapon. Against men who had never faced them, elephants did not need to kill everyone. They only needed to make the first ranks hesitate. Imagine the Roman camp before the battle. Fires low. Men repairing straps and checking spearheads by touch. The older soldiers trying not to show uncertainty. The younger ones listening too closely to every sound beyond the ditch. Stories would have moved faster than facts. Some would say the animals were monsters from India. Some would claim they could not be wounded. Others would laugh too loudly and say a spear was a spear, flesh was flesh, and anything that bled could die. But laughter can be a shield, and sometimes the thinnest shield is the one men hold before dawn. The officers had to understand what rumor could do. Panic was not a private weakness. Panic moved. It passed from hand to hand, from the first man who stepped backward to the second man who saw him do it. A Roman line could survive wounds, noise, even defeat in one part of the field, but if the mind broke before the enemy arrived, no formation could save it. Commanders could order shields forward. They could order spears lowered. They could not order the body to ignore the sight of a creature taller than a mounted man advancing with a tower on its back. At Heraclea, in 280 BC, the question became real. The Romans under Publius Valerius Laevinus faced Pyrrhus near the river Cyrus. On paper, this was a contest between political worlds, a rising Italian republic and a Hellenistic king with the prestige of Eastern warfare behind him. On the ground, it was sweat, dust, fear, and noise. The river glittered under the sun. Armor grew hot against skin. Men shifted their weight in the line and tried to read the enemy through the haze. They saw the phalanx first, a forest of long spears moving with cold discipline. They saw cavalry, bright and dangerous. And behind them, waiting like a second battle, stood the elephants. The old order of Roman war depended on contact. The legionary expected to close distance, survive the first shock, and turn the fight into a brutal contest of nerve and handwork. Shields locked. Pilums flew. Swords came out. Men shoved, stabbed, cursed, slipped in blood, and trusted that the man beside them would not disappear. Against many enemies, this worked because Roman discipline could absorb the first violence and answer with pressure. But an elephant did not meet the shield wall as another man did. It changed the scale of the fight. The animal's forehead was too high. Its feet were too heavy. Its smell was strange, hot and musky, cutting through the stink of men and horses. Its trunk moved with an intelligence that felt almost wrong, reaching, curling, striking. Tusks could be capped or armed. Towers held javelin men or archers who looked down on the battlefield from a height that made ordinary soldiers feel exposed. Even when an elephant did not crush a man, it forced him to imagine being crushed. That imagination did damage before the first body fell. Pyrrhus understood timing. Elephants thrown in too early could be isolated, wounded, frightened, or wasted. Held too long, they might never shape the battle at all. Their value was not only in their bodies but in the moment when they entered the mind of the enemy. When the Roman cavalry pressed hard and the fight became dangerous, Pyrrhus released the force his opponents had not truly measured. The elephants came forward. The sound must have changed first. Not the clean rhythm of hooves, but a layered, unsettling thunder, feet striking earth, harness creaking, men shouting from towers, handlers calling commands, trunks screaming above the clash of weapons. Roman horses, trained for battle but not for this, began to fail. A horse could be brave against noise. It could be hardened against blood. But to a horse, the elephant was not an enemy in human terms. It was a wrongness, a moving cliff with the smell of a predator and the size of a nightmare. The cavalry recoiled. Some mounts reared. Others twisted sideways, smashing formation from within. Riders fought their own animals before they could fight Pyrrhus. A soldier can be ordered to die where he stands, but a terrified horse does not understand patriotism. Once the cavalry lost order, the Roman flank became vulnerable. The elephant had struck not merely men, but the relationship between man, animal, and command. For the infantry, the sight was worse because it unfolded slowly. There is a particular terror in watching danger approach at walking pace. A missile is sudden. A sword is immediate. But a huge animal crossing open ground gives the mind time to build its own execution. Men saw what was coming. They could count the steps. They could hear screams where the first contact happened and understand that their turn was being carried toward them, not by fate, but by muscle and training. The first impact was not a neat line breaking like a diagram. It was fragments. A shield slammed backward. A man disappeared beneath a foot. A spear glanced off thick hide or buried shallowly and shook in the animal's flesh. Someone tried to reach the handler and was struck down from above. Someone else stood firm for 3 heartbeats longer than instinct allowed, then vanished into dust. The Roman formation, built on human scale, suddenly had gaps torn into it by a force that did not care about the courage of individuals. Yet the elephants were not invincible. That is what makes the story more human, and more brutal. They could bleed. They could panic. They could turn back into their own lines if wounded badly enough. Their strength was also a risk, because terror has no loyalty once it escapes control. Handlers carried tools to kill or disable animals that went mad, a terrible admission hidden inside the weapon itself. The elephant was power, but it was living power, and living power can refuse the plan. The Romans learned this with the cold speed of a people who survived by adapting. At Heraclea, the lesson came at a cost. Pyrrhus won the battle, but he paid heavily for it. His professional army, difficult to replace so far from home, bled for every step. Roman losses were severe, but Rome did not collapse. It absorbed the shock. It buried men. It raised more. The Republic had a terrifying talent for turning defeat into instruction. After Heraclea, no Roman commander could pretend elephants were only rumors. They became a problem to be solved. Men studied how horses reacted. They considered noise, fire, missiles, terrain, and spacing. They learned that elephants were most dangerous against packed fear and most vulnerable when separated, harassed, blinded, wounded, or driven into confusion. The battlefield became a classroom where the tuition was paid in bodies. At Asculum the following year, Pyrrhus again brought his elephants into the fight. Again they mattered. Again Rome suffered. But the pattern was changing. The Romans began preparing anti-elephant measures, including wagons and devices meant to frighten or injure the animals, though not every invention worked as intended. The deeper answer was not a single clever trick. It was discipline under a new kind of pressure. It was the slow transformation of the unknown into a known danger. This is the difference between shock and conquest. Shock can win a day. It can throw a line into confusion, make proud men stumble backward, make commanders misjudge the rhythm of battle. But conquest requires repetition. It requires a system that keeps working after the enemy understands it. Pyrrhus had elephants, excellent troops, and personal brilliance. Rome had something less glamorous and more dangerous in the long term, the ability to keep coming back, to make other people's weapons part of its own education. The psychological effect, though, should not be softened by hindsight. To say the Romans adapted is true. It is also too clean. Before adaptation came fear. Before tactics came men who heard the animal scream and felt their mouth go dry. Before strategy came the first soldier who looked up at a living tower and realized that all his training had prepared him for a different world. History often remembers the solution and forgets the first moment of helplessness. But that moment is where change begins. The elephant also exposed the limits of cultural certainty. Roman soldiers believed in Roman methods because those methods had worked. That belief was not foolish. It was earned. But every military system is partly a story it tells about reality. The legion told a story of discipline, civic duty, compact formations, and controlled violence. The elephant told another story, that war could arrive from beyond your map, carrying an animal your fathers had never named, using fear as deliberately as iron. Pyrrhus himself became trapped inside the cost of his victories. The battles that made him famous also drained the army he needed to continue. A victory that destroys the victor's strength is a warning disguised as glory. The elephants helped him win moments of decision, but they could not solve distance, manpower, politics, supply, and Rome's refusal to behave like a defeated city. The animal could break a flank. It could not break a society willing to replace the men it lost. Years later, Rome would face elephants again in greater numbers, most famously against Carthage. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps would burn the image into memory, elephants moving through snow, empire carried on wounded feet. But by then the Roman mind had already been marked. The first encounters had taught them that the world was larger and stranger than Italian warfare. They had learned that courage without flexibility becomes pride, and pride can be crushed. For the men who survived those early battles, the memory may not have been grand. It may have been a smell, a sound, a flash of tusk through dust. It may have been the scream of a horse that would not obey, or the sight of a shield flattened into mud. Veterans do not always remember history the way historians write it. They remember the second when the line stopped feeling solid. They remember the thing that made them wonder whether the old rules still held. That is why the first Roman encounter with war elephants matters. Not because elephants alone changed the destiny of Rome. They did not. Not because Pyrrhus possessed a magical weapon. He did not. It matters because the battlefield revealed a truth that every empire eventually meets: the most dangerous weapon is often the one that attacks certainty before it attacks flesh. It makes trained men feel untrained. It makes commanders see their plans as fragile. It makes a familiar world suddenly foreign. In the end, Rome survived the elephants. It studied them, endured them, and eventually learned to defeat them. But survival did not erase the first shock. For one terrible moment on an Italian field, the the future rulers of the Mediterranean stood beneath the shadow of animals from another military universe, and the ground moved under their feet. The line held, broke, reformed, and learned. And somewhere in that dust, Rome discovered that power does not belong to the side that never feels fear. It belongs to the side that can feel fear, understand it, and still return to the field changed.